Magna Carta was not a document of human rights, let alone universal rights. It was a charter of rights drafted by land barons to protect their rights against the king and taxing them in ways they didn't want. That's what it was. Yes, the ultimate meaning of it is that the king is not above the law. Okay, great. But it's not a document of human rights at all, let alone universal human rights. And the Quran, looking at the quotations of those who think the Quran advocates universal human rights, there's no convincing case at all. There's no language like one finds in the American Declaration of Independence or in the French Constitution or in Locke. It's just not there. And there are Islamic scholars who recognize this and point it out. One in particular, I don't know how to say his name, but he points out that it's just not there in the Quran. And he focuses on Sharia law, which is partly based on the Quran, partly based on the oral tradition of the Prophet Muhammad over the next 200 years. But you find slavery is lawful, apostasy has the death penalty, women are compared to farmers' fields, and the rights are based on faith, not on being as human as such. So he argues it's not there, but if it's reinterpreted, it can be made compatible with the modern idea of universal human rights. Maybe, but the point still is it's not there. People are projecting it back into the past. I suspect the same thing's going to happen if one does research on Ashoka the Great, on the ancient Stoics, including Cicero, but again, I haven't pursued those lines, but I've seen it. What seems to be happening is that a meme complex evolved piggybacking on the rise of democracy in the European Enlightenment. Now, why would these two different complexes of ideas evolve together? Meticists will point out that ideas evolve together if they mutually increase the survival and reproduction of the ideas. Memes are like genes. Now, what does the meme complex for universal human rights do in furthering democracy? What it does is it provides a check and balance against the excesses of democracy. John Stuart Mill called it the tyranny of the majority. That's the fatal flaw, one might argue, of democracy. The tyranny of the majority. What universal human rights talk does is it protects people from the tyranny of the majority. The two ideas further the spread of each other, so they are combined. So as I like to say, the meme complex of universal human rights piggybacked on the meme complex of democracy spreading from the European Enlightenment. You didn't get this in ancient Greece and Rome, even though democracy was there. Why? Because democracy was inclusive back then. Sorry, it was not inclusive, it was exclusive. It was confined to free male citizens. But now in the European Enlightenment, it started to spread, and the idea of universal human rights gradually grew and grew. Now, one problem here is if one believes that there are such things as universal human rights, what are they, and how many are there? A similar problem plagued Plato in a completely different domain over 2,000 years ago. He believed in the forms. And one of the problems that was raised against him, and he knew about it, it came out in his dialogue Parmenides, is how many forms are there? Is there there's a form of good, is there a form of evil, is there a form of mud, hair, and the list goes on and on. The problem with scope. Universal human rights has a similar problem, the problem of scope. If we allow the scope to increase, it becomes a sort of reductio ad absurdum. It becomes absurd. The idea just goes crazy. people claiming that bodybuilders could claim steroids as a natural right. And that their rights are being denied by this organization and that organization. Okay. Now, what if we take biological history seriously? Evolutionary history, as it's properly understood in the biological sense. We don't get any justification of universal human rights. The universal acid, as Daniel Dennett liked to call it, does its job here as well. Why? Humans are roughly one of 30 million existing species. We're part of a tree. Evolution is gradual, incremental. To single out one particular species, humans, and say they have natural rights, but all the others do not, smacks of speciesism, to use Peter Singer's beautiful term. Right? And what if we want to grant rights to other species than humans? But we're no longer talking about human rights now. We're talking about something else. The question then becomes, what criteria are we going to use? And any answer is going to seem arbitrary. For example, Tom Regan, vegetarian, argues that lots of animals have equal natural rights. Why? Because they have consciousness. And consciousness is what gives them inherent value and the right to life, etc. But if we look at consciousness from an evolutionary point of view, it's arguably either an adaptation or a byproduct of other adaptations. Let's just say it's an adaptation. Well, the thing about adaptations is they come in different degrees and they come in different kinds, just like eyes. To say they all have the equal value and equal rights sounds odd. Even among human beings, where we believe that humans all have the equal right to life, we don't behave that way. As one philosopher pointed out, we don't do that in medical ethics. In medical ethics, the criterion typically in practice is quality of life, not equal rights. Now, another philosopher named Alan White argues that only persons have rights. Non-persons do not have rights. And so because persons are the only entities that have rights, we can attribute quite properly natural rights to the unconscious, to unconscious persons, to mentally retarded persons. Why? Because if it wasn't for bad luck, they would be like other persons. No problem. But then we're not talking about human rights. We're talking about person rights. And that's a very different thing. People often confuse the two, but technically they're different terms. They have different meanings. They overlap. Everybody here is a human and a person. But not all humans arguably are persons, and not all persons are humans. If there are Klingons, they would be persons but not humans. In Western theology, God is a person, but God's not a human. These are different concepts. Many people try to base human rights on human features, such as reason, language, moral agency, a moral sense. The problem is they're thinking in a way biologists call synchronically, not diachronically. If I could have the overhead projector turned on. It's a horrible diagram, but it does its job. Right? This one right here. This is from George Gaylord Simpson's book, 1961, Principles of Animal Taxonomy. But it illustrates the difference between diachronic and synchronic. Right? Diachronic is looking at evolution over time. So you build up the timeline that way. And what you see is branching speciation. When we think of humans, we don't